June 14th, 1939. Maginot Line sector of Hackenberg, Lorraine, France. The air down here was colder than anyone expected. A metallic chill that clung to the skin, heavy with the scent of oil, concrete, and stale air. A narrow corridor stretched ahead, illuminated by a line of humming bulbs that trembled with every vibration from the generator room below. The only sounds were the rhythmic hiss of air compressors and the echoing footsteps of men in uniform boots. Major John Anderson, a British military observer seconded to France, brushed a layer of dust off his leather gloves as he followed a French engineer deeper into the underground maze. Anderson had seen bunkers before, trenches, pillboxes, coastal forts, but never anything like this. The man leading him, Commandant Henri Lefèvre, wore his fatigue cap low and spoke with the pride of someone showing off a masterpiece. "You see, Major, this is not a bunker," he said, his voice echoing softly in the corridor. "This is a city, built not for days of war, but for months of survival." Anderson nodded, taking in the sight as they entered a chamber the size of a cathedral nave. It was the operations center of Ouvrage Hackenberg, one of the most formidable strongpoints of the Maginot Line. The concrete walls were thick enough to withstand direct artillery hits. Rows of telephones connected to command posts miles apart. Maps, plotting tables and periscopes hung from the walls. He looked around in awe. "You could fight a whole war from down here." Lefèvre smiled faintly. That was the idea. Outside, the fields of Lorraine were quiet, green and peaceful under a late spring sun. Farmers tended their crops unaware, or perhaps unwilling, to think about the invisible fortress sleeping beneath their feet. But below, hundreds of soldiers trained in fluorescent-lit tunnels, manning machine gun turrets, maintaining the ventilation system, stocking food reserves. Anderson followed Lefèvre through a labyrinth of hallways, to the barracks, where men played cards under the buzzing lights, to the mess hall, where the smell of soup drifted through the recycled air, to the ammunition elevator, which could hoist shells straight into the armored turrets above. "What you see here," Lefèvre said, placing a hand on the steel bulkhead, "is the future of defense. Never again will France be invaded through her open plains. Every kilometer of our frontier is fortified, and every soldier underground is protected." But Anderson hesitated. "And if the enemy simply goes around it?" Lefèvre's smile faded. "Then they would face our allies," he said, almost defensively. "Belgium, Britain, and perhaps you, Major." Anderson said nothing. The hum of machinery filled the silence, a low, relentless growl, like the breathing of some buried beast. They reached the ammunition gallery, an underground railway stretching farther than the eye could see. Carts clattered along the narrow tracks, transporting shells and supplies between living quarters and the armored casemates. Overhead, cables ran like veins across the concrete, feeding power to every system. Anderson ducked under a low beam, studying the structure. The concrete had been poured in layers, reinforced with steel bars thicker than a man's wrist. The air vents were shielded against gas attacks, the doors sealed tight as a submarine's hatch. "This entire sector," Lefèvre said, "could resist bombardment for months. We have power, water, air, food. We could survive cut off from the world above." Anderson glanced at him. "And what happens if the world above changes?" Lefèvre frowned, but didn't answer. As they walked back toward the command post, a distant thud rolled through the tunnel, the sound of artillery practice from a nearby casemate. The lights flickered briefly, then steadied again. Lefèvre looked up, almost proudly. "Even the earth trembles," he said, "but we do not." In that moment, Anderson understood what drove these men. After the slaughter of 1914-1918, France had sworn never to fight another war in the open fields. The Maginot Line wasn't just concrete and steel. It was a nation's trauma turned into architecture, fear solidified into fortress walls. That night, Anderson was escorted to the officers' quarters, a small but clean room with a steel door, electric lamp, and a vent that whispered softly with filtered air. As he unbuttoned his tunic and sat on the narrow cot, he listened to the machinery humming through the walls. Above him, the stars glittered over Lorraine. Below, the fortress breathed. In his notebook he wrote, "The French have buried their army in the earth." Ingenious, but one wonders if they've also buried their future. He closed the journal, unaware that within a year his words would prove prophetic, and the fortress he had walked through, unshakable in theory, would face a test it was never designed to endure. May 10th, 1940. 05:35 hours. Ouvrage, Hackenberg, Lorraine, France. The war had come to life in the distance first. A rumble, faint but unmistakable, rolling across the hills like thunder from an approaching storm. Inside the tunnels, the sound arrived not as noise, but as vibration, a low, rhythmic pulse that shook dust from the overhead pipes. In the command post, alarms began to wail. Men scrambled from their bunks, grabbing helmets, rifles, and gas masks. Boots pounded against concrete. The mechanical heartbeat of the fortress, the constant hum of generators and pumps, quickened as if sensing danger. Major Anderson was gone by now, recalled to London months earlier, but his old guide, Commandant Lefèvre, was still here, now pale and tight-lipped as he studied the telegraph tapes spitting from the wall. Messages arrived every minute, one from Luxembourg, another from Sedan. Each one worse than the last. The Germans had not attacked the Maginot Line. They had gone around it. "Reports from the Meuse," said a lieutenant, breathless, holding a slip of paper. "They've crossed in force. Armored divisions, Stukas, everything." Lefèvre didn't look up. "Then our role is clear," he said quietly. "We hold. We defend our sector until the last shell." He turned to the map. A vast blueprint of the Lorraine sector spread across the table, dotted with tiny lights representing each fortress. Hackenberg, Michelsberg, Anzeling, Rochonvillers, a chain of steel teeth stretching across the border. Each was self-sufficient, connected by underground rail lines and telephone cables. Each could fight alone if needed. At 07 hours, the first German artillery shells landed. The sound was nothing like Lefèvre remembered from the Great War. It wasn't the slow, thunderous pounding of old siege guns. It was fast, sharp, modern. High-velocity shells from mobile howitzers and dive bombers slicing the air above. The fortress shuddered, lights flickered, and dust filled the corridor. But the concrete held. Inside Block 9, Sergeant Dupont and his crew sealed the armoured doors and manned the 75mm gun turret. The mechanism whirred, elevating through layers of reinforced concrete until the steel dome surfaced above ground like the snout of a buried beast. Range 1,000 meters. Dupont shouted, "Target! Enemy infantry crossing the ridge!" The gun roared. The entire turret recoiled and resettled with a mechanical hiss. The air smelled of cordite and oil. From the outside, Hackenberg looked almost alive. Domes rotating, turrets rising, machine guns sweeping across the fields. The Germans, unprepared for the fortress's range and precision, pulled back temporarily. Lefèvre watched the exchange through a periscope feed. "Magnifique," he murmured. "They built this to last a century," and for a moment it seemed true. The fortress was a marvel of engineering. Ventilation filters, diesel generators, ammunition elevators, and underground railways connecting combat blocks miles apart. Even as shells fell, life below continued with military precision. Cooks served rations in the mess hall, Electricians checked voltage in the generator room. Medics stood by with gas masks and morphine. Yet outside the fortress, beyond the reach of its guns, France was collapsing. German panzers had poured through the Ardennes, sweeping into Belgium and racing toward Paris. The Maginot Line, once seen as impregnable, now stood like a locked door in an empty house. Its defenders were untouched and irrelevant. Days turned into weeks. News grew worse. The army was retreating. Paris had fallen. The British had evacuated at Dunkirk. Lefèvre received the order he had dreaded: hold position. Do not withdraw. Maintain the line. He obeyed, but the men grew restless. Some whispered that they'd been forgotten. Others joked bitterly that the fortress was so secure. Even France couldn't reach them. Then, one night in late June, the ventilation suddenly failed. The lights dimmed. The air thickened. Panic rippled through the lower tunnels until mechanics discovered the cause: a power cable severed by a near miss above ground. They worked in total darkness for hours, torches flickering, the stench of oil choking the air. In the gloom, Lefèvre walked the corridor with a lantern. The soldiers saluted him as he passed, their faces pale and streaked with soot. He could see the fatigue in their eyes, not from battle, but from waiting, trapped in a fortress that no longer had a war to fight. At 23:10 the power returned. The lights flickered back to life, revealing the sweat and dust on every face. The men cheered weakly, and Lefèvre forced a smile. But inside, he knew the truth. The fortress had done its duty, yet it had become a monument to an outdated vision of war. Still, orders were orders. He walked back to the command post and wrote in his logbook, "We are still here, the fortress lives, but France does not." The next day, an armistice was announced. June 25th, 1940. 05 hours. Ouvrage, Hackenberg, Lorraine, France. Silence had settled over the tunnels like a fog. No more rumbling of artillery, no orders crackling over the telephone lines, only the distant hum of the generators and the weary breathing of men who had not seen daylight in weeks. Commandant Henri Lefèvre stood before the fortress's steel door, hands clasped behind his back, as two German officers approached from the sunlight beyond. Their boots crunched on gravel, crisp against the morning air. Behind them, a white flag fluttered above the entrance shaft. Lefèvre's men lined the corridor in silence. Their uniforms were dusty, their faces hollow. Some looked relieved, others looked betrayed. They had fought, or rather waited to fight, in a fortress that was never truly tested. Now they were being asked to surrender it intact. The senior, German Oberst Klaus Richter, removed his cap and nodded stiffly. "Commandant Lefèvre, you have our respect," he said in deliberate French. "Your men fought with discipline. Your fortress, impressive work." Lefèvre's expression didn't change. It was designed to protect France, not impress her enemies. Richter studied him for a long moment before replying, "You were betrayed by strategy, not by engineering." The Germans inspected the complex slowly, almost reverently. They marveled at the command center, the electric kitchens, the rail system deep underground. One officer tapped the concrete wall and whistled. "No bomb could touch this," he muttered. Lefèvre followed them, silent, as they toured what had once been his world: the machine rooms, the barracks, the armories. When they reached the power generator hall, Richter stopped and looked around with genuine astonishment. "Your engineers thought of everything," he said. "Air filtration, independent power, self-contained water. This could survive a siege of a year." Lefèvre replied quietly, "We did not expect to be bypassed instead." Richter said nothing. The echo of their footsteps filled the hall like the ticking of a clock, counting down to history's verdict. When the inspection was done, Lefèvre was ordered to hand over his sidearm. He hesitated only briefly before removing the pistol from his belt and placing it on the table. "The fortress is yours," he said. "Treat it with the respect of men who built it not for glory, but for peace." Richter inclined his head, then motioned for his men to take control of the facility. The German flag was raised above Hackenberg that afternoon. Deep below, in the canteen, French soldiers gathered for a final meal. Cans of preserved beef, bread, gone stale. A silence heavier than the concrete itself. Corporal Julien Roche, barely 21, leaned toward his friend and whispered, "So this is how it ends. We hide underground while Paris burns." His friend shrugged. "At least we're alive." "But what was it for?" Roche muttered, staring at the grey wall. "All this for nothing?" Lefèvre sat alone in his quarters that evening, writing one last entry in his logbook. "The Maginot Line has fallen, though not by force. Our walls remain unbroken, yet they stand as monuments to fear, not courage. We believed safety could be built in concrete, but war moves faster than walls." He closed the notebook and set it on his desk. Above him, the fortress lights dimmed one by one. The hum of machinery slowed as the generators were shut down. The air grew still, heavy, and strangely intimate, as if the great fortress itself were holding its breath. Outside, dawn crept across the Lorraine hills. The farms and fields looked unchanged, peaceful even, but beneath them lay a sleeping city of tunnels, its purpose buried along with France's old faith in defense. Months later, the Germans returned, not to destroy Hackenberg, but to study it. Engineers in Wehrmacht uniforms walked the galleries, with notebooks in hand, tracing cables, measuring walls, sketching blueprints. The Maginot Line had become a classroom for the enemy. They dismantled some turrets, repurposed others. The fortress that was meant to defend France would, in time, help fortify German positions against the Allies. And yet, even under occupation, Hackenberg endured. Its machinery refused to die. Its walls remained solid. Somewhere in the dark, graffiti appeared, scratched by French hands, perhaps left by prisoners or resistance workers. Elle vit encore. She still lives. Years later, when the war turned again and the Allies swept back through France, the Maginot Line would awaken once more, not as a symbol of arrogance, but as a shelter, a relic reborn in the storm. But for now, in the summer of 1940, she slept, a fortress without a purpose, a masterpiece of engineering betrayed by the speed of history itself. November 1944, Lorraine, France. For 4 long years, the fortress had slept under the German flag. Its tunnels had echoed with new voices, foreign, sharp, and guttural, as Wehrmacht technicians repurposed the old systems for their own use. The French markings were painted over, the command center rewired for German communications, and the once proud emblems of the French Republic replaced by black eagles and swastikas. But now that sound was returning. A deeper rumble, one Lefèvre himself might have recognized, the heavy rhythmic growl of distant artillery rolling across the fields once again. The U.S. Third Army, under General George S. Patton, was pushing through Lorraine, and the Maginot Line, forgotten, obsolete, and half-buried, was suddenly in the path of a new war. On a grey morning in late November, Lieutenant William Harris of the 90th Infantry Division crouched behind a ridge overlooking the Hackenberg sector. The wind bit through his greatcoat. Below, the ground was cratered and muddy, but the outline of the fortress was still there, faint scars in the earth. Turrets, pillboxes, the tips of steel domes that glistened like eyes. "Jesus," muttered one of his men. "They built a damn city underground." "They did," Harris said quietly, adjusting his binoculars. "And the Krauts are still in it." The fortress had become a strong point in the German defensive line. Inside, a garrison of Wehrmacht soldiers had reactivated several of the old French turrets. They fired from within the same concrete galleries Lefèvre once commanded, using the same ammunition elevators, the same armored firing ports. The Americans couldn't bomb it, too strong. They couldn't go around it. The hills were mined, the valleys under fire. So they did the unthinkable. They went in. At dawn, under the cover of smoke, American infantry advanced across the frozen fields. Mortars thundered. Sherman tanks rolled forward, their guns pounding the visible blocks of the fortress. Machine gun fire answered from the turrets, sparking off armor like hail. "Keep moving! Keep moving!" Harris shouted, sprinting from crater to crater. The air smelled of cordite and frost. Above, the sky was a dull winter grey. A shell struck the ground nearby, flinging earth and snow into the air. The blast threw Harris off his feet. His ears rang, and for a moment the world was a blur of smoke and screaming. Then, through the haze, he saw the entrance shaft of Hackenberg, half collapsed but still intact. The Germans had sealed it, but the blast had cracked the concrete. Harris crawled toward it, waving his squad forward. "There, that's our way in." It took hours of close-quarters fighting, grenades, flamethrowers, bursts of automatic fire, echoing through narrow tunnels that twisted like veins. The deeper they went, the darker it grew. The air was thick with dust and heat, and the lights flickered as the old wiring strained under the chaos. Harris led the final push into the command post. When the door burst open, the scene was surreal. Maps still on the wall, control panels humming faintly, and a German officer standing behind a desk that had once belonged to Henri Lefèvre. The man raised his hands, eyes wide, face grey with exhaustion. "It is over," he said in broken English. "We surrender." Silence followed. The battle for Hackenberg, a fortress built for one war, conquered in another, and retaken in a third, was over. As American engineers explored the tunnels, in the following days they marveled at what they found: the immense generator halls, the living quarters untouched since 1940, the underground train that still ran on rusted tracks. The fortress, though scarred, was alive. One report described it simply: "Fort Hackenberg remains operational, systems functional, engineering extraordinary." When word spread that the Americans had taken it intact, a few old French officers, now with the Free French Forces, made a pilgrimage back to see it. Among them was Henri Lefèvre, older now, thinner, but still carrying himself with quiet dignity. He walked through the corridors he once commanded, his footsteps slow, echoing softly. Dust drifted through the beams of his flashlight. When he reached the old command center, he placed a hand on the steel table and closed his eyes. So much had changed. France, the war, the world. But the fortress remained, stubborn as ever. Captain Harris, standing beside him, asked quietly, "You built this, didn't you?" Lefèvre smiled faintly. "I didn't build it," he said. "France did. I only gave it a heartbeat." He turned toward the concrete wall where, years ago, someone had carved the words, "Elle vit encore." He brushed the dust away with his fingertips, revealing the letters once more. "Yes," he whispered, "she still lives." In the months that followed, Hackenberg served a new purpose, first as a shelter for civilians during the Allied advance, then as a depot for captured German equipment. Soldiers who passed through its tunnels often felt a strange respect for it, as if walking inside the bones of something both ancient and eternal. Even Patton himself, visiting the site in early 1945, reportedly remarked, "If the French had fought their war the way they built their forts, they'd have stopped Hitler cold." But the truth was more complicated. Hackenberg, like France itself, had survived not because it was perfect, but because it endured. And when the guns finally fell silent and Europe began to heal, the fortress remained, a living monument beneath the quiet fields of Lorraine, humming softly in the dark, waiting for history to remember. Autumn, 1952. Lorraine, France. The war was long over, but the fortress still breathed. Deep under the soil of Lorraine, beneath the farmland and the rusting wrecks of forgotten battles, Ouvrage Hackenberg remained alive, a vast subterranean skeleton of steel, concrete, and memory. Major Henri Lefèvre stood at the entrance once again, this time without a uniform. His hair had gone white, his gait slower, but his eyes still carried the quiet vigilance of a soldier who had lived too long in the dark. Around him, a small group of young officers from the newly formed French army of the Rhine followed with notebooks and cameras, eager to study what had once been the crown jewel of France's defences. "Every door you see," Lefèvre said, his voice echoing through the tunnel, "is pressure-sealed. Every corridor reinforced. It could withstand a direct hit from a 420-meter howitzer." He paused, resting a hand against the wall. The concrete felt cold, but alive with vibration, the same hum of hidden machines that had pulsed there for decades. "Why bury yourselves underground?" one of the officers asked. "Surely, sir, you knew mobility would win the next war." Lefèvre smiled faintly. "We did not build for the next war. We built to stop the last one from happening again." The young men nodded, not entirely understanding. They had been born too late to know Verdun or the shellfire of 1916. To them, war was faster now: planes, missiles, nuclear fire. But Lefèvre still believed there was something sacred about what they had made. They continued through the galleries, past the generator halls, the ammunition elevators, and the long underground rail system that could once move entire platoons between sectors in minutes. The engineers of the 1930s had envisioned a machine that could live, breathe, and fight beneath the earth, powered by human endurance and mechanical precision. And in many ways, it had succeeded. One of the officers asked quietly, "Do you regret it, Commandant? All this work, all this brilliance, just to be bypassed?" Lefèvre stopped. The question hung in the cold air. "I regret nothing," he said. "We gave France time to believe she could be safe again. That is no small thing." He looked down the long corridor, its lights stretching into infinity, and added, "And when the world burned a second time, this place still protected lives. It became a shelter, not a tomb. Perhaps that is enough." The group reached the command post, now a museum of sorts, preserved by local veterans and the Ministry of Defense. The old control panels were still intact. The maps of 1939 still hung on the walls, faded but legible. On one corner of the table lay Lefèvre's old journal, its cover worn smooth by time. He opened it slowly. Inside, his handwriting was still there, clear and strong. The final entry dated June 25, 1940. "We believed safety could be built in concrete, but war moves faster than walls." He closed the book and turned to the men. The Maginot Line was not a mistake. It was a mirror. It showed us what we feared most and what we could build when we refused to be afraid. As they departed, Lefèvre lingered one last time in the main corridor. He touched the wall and listened to the faint hum of the generators still running in maintenance mode. In his mind, he could still hear the voices of his men: Dupont, Roche, the laughter echoing in the mess hall, the chatter of typewriters in the command room. The fortress had become a ghost city, but it was not dead. Years later, as France entered the Cold War, Hackenberg would again find a purpose. NATO engineers surveyed its tunnels, tested its blast doors, and realized that even after decades, its systems could still function. It became part of a new defensive network, the line against the east, the modern echo of the fear that had built it. By the late 20th century, Hackenberg had transformed once more, this time into a museum. Veterans guided tourists through the same tunnels where once they had waited for battle that never came. Families listened to the hum of ancient machines, smelled the oil and dust, and tried to imagine what it was like to live entombed in concrete, ready to fight a war that passed them by. And through it all, Lefèvre's story endured. The story of an engineer-soldier who had turned fear into architecture, who built a fortress not to glorify war, but to spare his country its horrors. The guide's voice echoes softly through the chamber today. They called it foolish, they called it wasteful. But when the bombs fell and the earth shook, this fortress stood firm. It did what it was built to do. It endured. Outside, the wind sweeps gently across the fields of Lorraine. Above the grass and the quiet farms, there is no sign of the vast structure below. But if you stand very still and listen carefully, you can hear it, the faint hum of machinery, the breathing of a buried giant. The fortress still lives, and so does the memory of those who built it.